Ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much for joining us. I am Brother Joe Paul, the Executive Director and Chief Operating Officer of the greatest fraternity in the world, Alpha Phi Alpha Fraternity Incorporated. And as part of our Advocacy in Action webinar series under the leadership of General President Dr. Everett B. Ward, we're pleased to introduce you to an intellectual conversation on the topic of the power of Black men in electoral politics. We have an all-star cast of outstanding brothers in the field to help guide our conversation with Brother Ramon Alexander, who's a state representative out of District 8 in Florida, Brother Dr. John Bullock, who's a councilman right here in our backyard where our headquarters are in Baltimore, and Brother L.G. Sims, who's the former Midwestern Region Vice President and Illinois State Senator. And it is moderated by an all-star himself, Brother Dr. Smickle. If we can bring Brother Smickle up so he can take over the show. We're excited that you're here. We're excited that you joined us. And there's our guy. Brother Dr. Smickle, welcome, my brother. How are you?
I'm doing quite well, brother. Thank you so very much. A lot going on in the world today. So a lot of activity and certainly a whole lot to talk about. And I'm just very thankful that I have the opportunity to moderate this discussion today. One of the things that I wanted to do at the top here is to reference two articles that I saw. And I think they give an interesting sort of bookend to our conversation today. The first was a New York Times article written in 2012, February of 2012, that goes like this. Black neighborhoods in key swing states hold enormous power to reshape politics in November and beyond. But in order to maximize this potential, progressives need to imagine and invest on an unprecedented scale. Black voters have consistently supported Democratic candidates over Republicans by stunning margins, about 90% to 10%. No other major demographic comes close to this level of support for either party. For every 10 new Black voters, 9 will likely vote for a Democrat and 1 for a Republican, yielding 8 net Democratic votes. In contrast, 10 new Latino voters who voted 70% Democratic and 30% Republican in 2018 would produce 4 net Democratic votes. For white college-educated women, this figure is 2. So said another way, 1 new Black voter has the same net effect as 2 new Latino voters or 4 new white college-educated female voters. While it's true that there are more eligible but non-voting people of other important demographics, there are more net Democratic votes available for new Black voters because of the huge differential in Democratic support. On the other hand, I do remember a New York Times article from a few years ago that had a startling headline that I was very upset at, very angry at, and then in reading more, understood the context, and I think we've been able to understand a little more of the context, particularly considering what's happening today. The headline goes like this: 1.5 million missing Black men, and goes on to say, in New York, almost 120,000 Black men between the ages of 25 and 54 are missing from everyday life. In Chicago, 45,000 are, and more than 30,000 are missing in Philadelphia. Across the South, from North Charleston, South Carolina, through Georgia, Alabama, and Mississippi, and up to Ferguson, Missouri, hundreds of thousands more are missing. They're missing largely because of early deaths or because they're behind bars. Remarkably, Black women who are 25 to 54 and not in jail outnumber Black men in that category by 1.5 million. For every 100 Black women in this age group living outside of jail, there are only 83 Black men. Among whites, the equivalent number is 99, near parity. So those numbers are very striking to me. And the question then becomes, there are a lot of questions that come out of this, certainly, but this is not a conversation that I want to use as a vehicle to add to those statistics more. I want us to have a hopeful conversation, a real conversation about both challenges and opportunities. It's a nonpartisan discussion. I want to be clear about that. But again, it's an opportunity to talk about the issues, concerns, barriers, and opportunities for Black men in electoral politics today. So I do want to start with Ramon Alexander. He is a state legislator from Florida, a fifth-generation product of Tallahassee, Florida, dating back to your great-great-grandparents, I understand. And it looks like you've been a rattler through and through. Is that right? Bleeding orange and green. You served as a legislative intern to former State Rep Curtis Richardson in the Florida House of Representatives. And you've had a stellar political career, which it looks like started as the president of the student body at Florida A&M. Is that right? You've had really incredible history in terms of advocacy for higher education. I'm really glad that you've joined us today. Would love for you to say a few words of greeting and introduce us to the work that you do.
Well, thank you very much, good brother, and it's great to be with you today. I'm a current member of the Florida House of Representatives, serving as the House Democratic Whip, but I also have the opportunity to serve on the Criminal Justice Committee and the Judiciary Committee. And so I have fully engulfed myself in juvenile justice reform issues, criminal justice reform issues throughout the state of Florida. And I look forward to having a very in-depth conversation about systemic racism and how these systems are currently having a significant impact on our quality of life to move forward as a state and as a country. So thank you for the opportunity to be here, and I look forward to the conversation.
And thank you, good brother. I next want to introduce Dr. John Bullock. Brother Bullock represents the 9th District, which covers West and Southwest Baltimore. He's the chair of the Housing and Urban Affairs Committee, as well as a member of the Commission on Historical and Architectural Preservation. Councilmember Bullock also serves on the Baltimore City Democratic Central Committee and was previously a member of the Board of Trustees for St. Mary's College in Maryland. Before he was elected officially, he was assistant professor in the Department of Political Science at Towson University and now a lecturer teaching courses in urban politics and metropolitan studies. I love that, brother. Those are my areas of key focus and concern. So thank you as well for joining us today, and would love to hear a few words about some of what you're working on.
Well, absolutely, and so great to be here. You know, one of the things that we look at in Baltimore, we have some very high disparities, particularly in one of the zip codes that represent 21223, where we have high rates of diabetes, hypertension, gun violence, vacant housing. And so, our work in housing is really around affordable housing, making sure that we have opportunities for folks to live comfortably and decently. But also, we recognize we have a large population of returning citizens. And so many of them, again, even though they're able to vote at this point, sometimes are not made aware of that fact. And so that makes a huge difference in some of these elections that we have currently and in the future. And so, I've been blessed and honored to not only be an educator and talk about political engagement, but also to model it for my students and for the community. And so Alpha has been a great part of it, but also I look forward to working with other organizations around voter registration, around getting the turnout. Our district has had low turnout over the years in Baltimore City. And as a nation, we have abysmal turnout. And so making sure that we get people to the polls and knowing their rights and their ability to participate. So again, I thank you for the opportunity to be a part of the conversation tonight.
All right, thank you, brother. Senator L.G. Sims Jr., my brother, is serving his first full term as state senator for Illinois' 17th Senate District, which includes portions of the south side of Chicago, Chicago's south suburbs, and Will and Connecticut counties. Is that right?
Kankakee.
Kankakee. Thank you, brother. He previously served nearly 4 terms as state representative of Illinois' 34th House District. And as a senator, you continue to put families and communities first. You've championed legislation focusing on improving the quality of our schools, strengthening the middle class, creating good paying jobs and economic opportunities. I definitely want to get into some of that tonight as well, brother. And I'm particularly interested in the criminal justice work that you're doing. I think there's, we'll get into a lot of that as well tonight. And you've shown some commitment to educating young people as well throughout the state by supporting education funding reform and allowing support for and pushing support for leveling the playing field from K-12 schools statewide. So thank you for that advocacy as well, brother. And would love to hear a few words about where you are, what you're working on.
Well, absolutely. And thank you so much, my brother, for having me and for hosting this discussion. This is an important discussion on the direction that we're going to go in our communities. I've as was mentioned, I'm serving in the Illinois Senate, and I've served in the Illinois House before. I currently serve as the chairman of the Senate's Criminal Law Committee. In that work, that's a continuation of the work I did when I was in the House, where I served as the House Judiciary Criminal Committee, where I worked on criminal justice reform matters. I was honored and privileged to work with my colleagues to put together make Illinois the first state in the entire country to have statewide protocols on body camera reform, pushing training reform for police and police officers, engaging in improving relations between law enforcement and the community. And that's been my focus for a long time. My focus has been taking a holistic approach to ensuring that we are dealing with the issues in our community, not just on criminal justice reform, but criminal justice reform is a part of it, because as we see our individuals who live in our community, African-American men are 6 times more likely to be incarcerated than their white counterparts. 1 out of 3 African-American men will come into contact with the criminal justice system in their lifetime. So we want to make sure that we are dealing with equity and equality and justice, and ensuring that African-American men and African-American people have all that they need and all they deserve. So I've taken a holistic approach to legislating, where we are not only dealing with criminal justice reform, but also education reform, investing in economic opportunities, investing in healthcare. The COVID-19 pandemic has shined a bright light on the ills that are plaguing our communities. And so now we have to make sure that we are investing in the solutions that will help to move our communities forward. So I am looking forward to this discussion tonight. It is timely discussion, and it is forward thinking, and I appreciate our fraternity having the fortitude to have these very candid conversations. So I'm looking forward to participating. Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you. And I want to go right into the questions. And I want to start with Brother Bullock. And leaning not just on your political experience, but also on your on the research that you've done in your academic career. And this is a question I want everybody to respond, but I'll start with you, Brother Bullock. We're already seeing the Willie Horton type ads start to go up around this election. We've seen tactics where there are attacks on mail-in voting, for example, and absentee balloting. Could you talk a little bit about how the ways in which African Americans, particularly Black men, are used as a wedge in our elections to stoke fear, stoke that kind of anger, tamp down vote in some areas and then accelerate it in others? Like, talk about the history of that and what you see on the ground.
So thank you, brother. It's an absolutely perfect question. One of the things, that we can look at, especially in this current atmosphere, is the terminology law and order. And so even if you think about that from a historical point of view, you have a president now who's saying that. But if you hearken back into the late 1960s, early 1970s, we saw a lot of our cities, including Baltimore, Washington, D.C., Philadelphia, New York, Los Angeles, Chicago, Detroit, all these cities that were having riots. And as our brother Dr. King would say, that riot is the language of the unheard. And so we're looking at, the issues of inadequate housing, education, employment, all those things being under the surface. But the catalyst oftentimes being police brutality that then brought these issues to the fore. And so rather than addressing those in a substantive fashion, you had a President Nixon at the time who talked about being law and order and making sure that they tamp down that type of militancy and response from Black leaders. And so that was very disastrous in those days, also led into the war on drugs and mass incarceration, all things that come along with that. We also look at how it does pay dividends in political elections when we see things like, the Willie Horton ad in 1988 election. So you had someone, who was ahead in an election who winds up, losing because of that imagery, right? And so you have, Dukakis being ahead by double digits, but the ability for Bush to use that as a wedge issue, making Democrats look weak on crime, also led to that defeat. And even now, we see the unrest and the outrage around the killing of unarmed black men. The response from the White House is not to look at issues of systemic racism. It's more so to say, hey, these people are out of control. If you reelect me, I'll make sure there's law and order. You look at the clearing of peaceful protesters in Washington, D.C. I mean, all those things are reprehensible. And so it all feeds into the political climate. Again, and there are multiple examples when we're talking about the Confederate flag and how that emerged in the civil rights movement as a way to then, dampen, the movement that was being spearheaded by ministers, educators, and everyday people within the Southern United States and throughout the country. So really, we're seeing just a return to the playbook that we saw in the 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s as it related to Black progress, Black voting rights. And as you mentioned even before, this whole assault on things like early voting, mail-in voting, trying to restrict the franchise. The 1965 Voting Rights Act was really targeted toward making sure those states that were infringing upon Black voting rights were then held accountable and that Blacks were able to vote. And then you saw the outcome in terms of increased members of the House of Representatives and other local and state offices now as those states were more even as it related to voting. And so now there's a desire to pull that back.
And we've also seen the Supreme Court take the guts out of the Voting Rights Act as well, right? Absolutely. And so we layer that on top, the legal challenges on top of that, right? So, brother, thank you for that, Brother Bullock. So, Brother Sims, I want to address this to you because one of the frequent responses by the president or others that again try to use Black men as this wedge in political discussions and in policy discussions. They often go to Chicago, right? They often that's reflexive for so many people. They talk about, yes, but the violence in Chicago. Talk about just the impact that has when you hear it and what you tell not just to, the legislator, not just what you tell your colleagues, but how you go back into the community and tell your constituents, don't be disheartened by that. How do you manage that?
And I appreciate that, and I represent one of the most diverse districts in the entire state, but I also represent a majority African-American district. So the population of my district is over 60% African-American. So, I have a large Black population, and the way that we discuss this, so that my district, as you mentioned in the outset, stretches from the south side of the city of Chicago, southeast side, down into the southern suburbs and in rural Will and Kankakee County. So the way that people in my district don't get disheartened because they know who they are. They know they are not the caricatures that our president would try to hearken on them. They know that they are good, hardworking people who are trying to do the best for themselves and their families. They know that they understand that they are trying to invest in their young people and their children. As we were talking earlier about this discussion of law and order, it harkens back to the slave patrols, but also the depiction of African-American men and the usage of the images of African-American men to burn these racist ideals into the consciousness of our country, so that you can pass legislation that would pull back the gains that we've made. When we start to talk about the strategy that President Nixon employed, the Southern strategy, because if you remember, up until that time, the South voted Democratic. But when you start to see the South change from Democrat to Republican, this was a political strategy to help peel votes away from the Democratic Party, so that you could take back both houses of Congress. You could occupy the White House, and you could push a legislative agenda. If you really start to think about the impact that our current president has had over the last several years of his presidency, he has appointed more judges to the federal bench in 3 years than President Obama got appointed in 8. he has changed the complexion of the federal judiciary for a generation. So when you start to talk about the policies and the undercutting of the Voting Rights Act, the Fair Housing Act, etc., police reform, the reason why it has been so difficult, and all of my colleagues on this phone can attest to this, the reason why legislating in this moment is so difficult is because you have these challenges that the Supreme Court has chipped away at what reasonable people would see as reasonable, coming down on the side of what is unreasonable and giving the police extreme power that a reasonable person would not have any other way. But so that's when we start to talk about the impact of elections. That's what it is. It is not just the presidency. It's at the federal judiciary. It's in the state house. It's in your local city council. So the reason I come back to what your original question, the way I talk about this with my constituents, they already know who they are. They don't have to be propped up, because they understand that this is an attack of outside forces that is not, does not reflect who they are and what they are trying to accomplish in this community.
Right, and I would turn to Brother Alexander now and talk about Florida. We always talk about Florida, right? Talking about Florida, as we've heard the history, and these brothers have outlined the history very well, and Brother Sims is absolutely on point in talking about his constituents knowing who they are. I think a lot about rewriting the narrative, right? And it seems to me that the fact that you have I think it's over 1 million formerly incarcerated in Florida now have their rights restored. I would love for you to talk a little bit about that and restoring the narrative of African Americans broadly, Black men in particular, and what was the impact of having their rights restored, being able to exercise those rights, and how perhaps elected officials are paying more attention to maybe communities that had not gotten a lot of attention and perhaps been pilloried as opposed to being lifted up.
Well, thank you, brother. And if you look at the last 4 election cycles in regards to the race for governor, they've all been determined by less than 1% of the vote. You look at back in 2010, I had the responsibility of building capacity. I chaired that effort for President Obama's reelection. And my responsibility was to engage surge voters, which are voters that would not participate in any election but for a specific reason, i.e. President Obama being on the ballot for reelection, coming out to vote, and as well as in engaging the Caribbean Haitian communities and the African American communities. We spent about $9.6 million to engage those communities, and we recognize that it was a high stakes game. When you look at the state of Florida, and we're still in legal limbo in regards to those 1.3 to 1.4 million registered voters being able to participate in the process that were convicted felons and have paid their debt to society. But obviously, you look at the Florida legislature right now, the Florida Senate is controlled by the Republicans by a 3-seat majority. In the House, the Republicans controlled by a 13-seat majority, but there are more registered Democrats in the state of Florida than there are Republicans. So you look at gerrymandering and all those dynamics and how those things have manifested, they have led to systematic impacts on our communities that aren't in our collective best interests. And so, there's the late great Reverend Moses General Miles once said that you cannot teach what you do not know, and you cannot lead where you do not go. And I think it's extremely important that we recognize, yes, our good brothers gave a historical perspective. I do agree that this is the 3rd period of redemption or attempt of redemption in our country. These dog whistles and the flames have been stoked, and all of these micro-targeting strategies have been utilized to create those type of conversations. But knowledge is not power. The application of knowledge is power. And so we have an obligation. We say we take our young people for granted, our progressives for granted. Well, President Obama did not do that. He didn't allow the traditional establishment or infrastructure for the politics to determine the outcome of the election. I had the opportunity to spend about $9.6 million in that role to ensure that we were engaging in building trust. when you talk about communication and interacting with people, it's about the method, it's about the message, but it's also about the messenger. And if people don't know who you are, they're not going to trust you. And so engaging them in that way and ensuring that we are able to get those surge voters, those progressive voters, to participate in the process. Florida is a classic example of that. We know that they're going to throw every available method possible to distract, to confuse. The way the mediums of media are purported now with social media, you're getting media and information and from different sources. And so it's very hard to ascertain and understand what is what and what is not. And so we have a responsibility to work with our young people and to not say, you're over here and come with us and your great-great-granddaddy voted, so you vote too, or somebody died, so you can vote. But to help them to fully understand the obligations and the responsibilities that we have. I'll give you a classic example. I serve as the ranking member of the Higher Education Appropriations Committee in the Florida House of Representatives. For 5 years, $987 million, almost $1 billion, was allocated to our state universities, and our HBCUs, particularly FAMU, out of that $987 million, only received $17 million. The system was designed for FAMU to fail. The system was designed for Bethune-Cookman to fail. Edward Waters College to fail. So when you don't make it a Democratic thing or you don't make it a Republican thing, I'm a Democrat, but everybody's potato salad doesn't taste the same. That doesn't mean anything, right? And so it comes down to the fact that who you are and what you stand for and what you believe in, and understanding how those issues impact your quality of life so that they are able to go on offense. And the last thing I would say, we are expecting to win playing defense, but I've never seen a football team or a basketball team win a game when you never had the ball. We have to give the ball to the next generation. Our quote unquote so-called progressives. They are progressives. They're just concerned about their future. We have labeled them as progressives. They want better for their children. And I think we have a responsibility to invest in them, to give them the chance to fight and advocate and be a part of our apparatus to change our communities for generations to come.
Yeah, and I thank you for that, brother, because I want to pick out something that you said earlier about your experience in the Obama years and kind of compare it now a little bit. You obviously get the sense and know, we know this from data, we know this from having experienced it, the tremendous amount of enthusiasm, for the president, not just during his first campaign, but certainly throughout his presidency. He was largely embraced by Americans broadly, but certainly the African-American community. And each of you, coming from the states of Illinois, Maryland, and Florida, have had African-Americans running for statewide office fairly recently. And my question for you, Brother Alexander, is, is there a legacy, if you will, from the Obama experience that you see has energized a lot of young people in terms of running for office, understanding the importance of having people that look like us in office? What's your experience with that?
Absolutely. Some people win by circumstance and some people win by happenstance and some people just win. And I think we have to purport ourselves in a way where we just win. And I think that comes down to helping young people in the process to understand that political science is a science. And you can have all the passions in the world to want to make a difference, but it is a different world. And you have to understand the fundamental components of that. And one of the things we did here in Florida through the State Legislative Black Caucus, we have formed political boot camps where we host young people in the state to train them on applied political science, on campaign management, on running campaigns, on grassroots organizing. And we've seen them go on to run for office, to be a part of the statewide apparatus. I had the opportunity to serve as North Florida political director for Governor Charlie Crist when he ran as a governor. I ran 37 of 67 counties for him. And you see these young people, they're crying out, looking for an opportunity. And so if we help them and we embrace them and we invest in them, we will get a return on our investment. So you're absolutely correct. There is energy there. And I think what we look for that callus that will inspire us, to give us that amazing speech. But when you are self-empowered and you're self-aware you will have the tools and the resources to go within your own individual communities to inspire and the masses, but you'll have the credibility to do so. Just because you have a message doesn't mean you have the credibility. And so your actions have to correspond with your words. You got to have some street cred. You have to have a consistent track record of success to ensure that you're able to move forward. And I think we need more people. You know, my personal philosophy is no lights, no cameras, just action. And so we're so caught up in this instant gratification of tweeting things and trying to be seen, trying to be recognized. But when you get into the work, when you get into the depths of public policy, when you get into the depths of electoral policy and you position yourself, people have no choice but to respect you. And I think as we impart that type of knowledge to our future, we'll be positioned to fight away some of these dog whistles, some of these tools that are being used to suppress the vote on our end and to stoke the flames to enhance the base on the other end to sustain power, which was built on the foundation of white supremacy and the whole concept of making America great again.
Now, and I want to stay on on the comments you made about science, the science of it, because it's so important. So, and I want to go to Brother Sims, because I know you've done a lot of work in schools, and brother, in Chicago and in other places around the country, they've taken civics out of schools. How do we communicate not just the science behind the work that we do, but the importance of political institutions in the day-to-day lives of Americans, particularly communities of color? Brother Sims, are these conversations happening where you are, and how do we add to those conversations about restoring civic education in schools and getting young people to understand the science behind the work that we do?
Absolutely. I am honored and I'm proud of the work that I've done in this area. So I passed legislation in terms of making sure that we had civics in school in Illinois. So making sure that students understood what their government does and what their government doesn't do, what their government can and what their government cannot do. I got my start as an intern. I started working for the first African-American woman to run and elected to be elected to the United States Senate from the state of Illinois, former Ambassador Carol Moseley Braun. I organized students for her back in the early 90s. I served as an intern because I wanted to understand how government works. And you're absolutely right. Government is a science. It is not just about bureaucrats. It is, if you are going to be successful in government, you have to understand what government is. I was chairman of the Council of State Governments Midwestern Legislative Conference last year. And every year the chair gets to pick an initiative. My initiative for the year was youth civic engagement. It was making sure that we taught civics in schools, but also gave our students and our young people the practical skills to be able to apply those knowledge to how they interact with the world every day. I've worked with an organization called Mikva's Challenge for a number of years, and it's an organization that takes young people and puts them to work in civic opportunities, and to ensure that they go into they become election judges, they are interns in political offices, they're interns in government offices, so that they come in and they get a chance to see government at its foundational levels. It's important that our young people have the opportunity to see government up close. They have to be able to understand what they're trying to accomplish. Because you can a dream without a plan is just that. It's a dream. When you have the ability to understand what you are trying to accomplish, you have the ability to change policy. And we have so many times that we've talked a lot about the next generation. One thing I have always been blessed at, and this is one of the reasons why civics education is so important to me, is because I have had some tremendous mentors, people who were willing to invest in me for nothing other than they understand that leadership is not a sprint. It is a relay race. You run your leg of the race and you pass the baton to the next runner. That is how leadership works. And I have had some tremendous mentors who are willing to invest in me so that I understood my responsibility, and then I would teach that responsibility to those who came behind me. And that's why civics education is important. For those of us who are old enough to remember Schoolhouse Rock, we remember how a bill becomes a law, and we remember all those kinds of things. But when you get beyond just the bill is introduced and it has to be passed by Congress and signed by the president to become law, when you get past that, there's a whole other world out there. My brother from Florida talks about the investment in the apparatus of the entire process. There are individuals who are making millions of dollars in government representing private companies, but we don't have individuals who understand the business of government. So it's incumbent upon us to ensure that our young people understand that government is not just serving as a frontline worker in a state agency or a city agency. It's about working in policy, working in government advocacy, making sure that you have you're working all the other areas that you can affect policy. So understanding how policy works is critical to our success in this effort.
And from that point, Brother Bullock, let me ask you. I want to ask you as well about the importance of civics in schools and understanding government processes. But we've also been hearing a lot about reforms in actual voting. In New York, I think next year's election, we're going to be doing ranked choice voting for the first time. I'm really anxious to see how that turns out. I wonder, when we're talking about all of these reforms, are these reforms actually helping provide more access and more agency for African Americans, particularly Black men? Or are they restricting it in some way? Are there good reforms, better reforms, and not good reforms at all that are being talked about, especially as this president attacks mail-in voting, which I imagine would increase voter access?
So it's really a fantastic question, and the jury's still out with a lot of some of those reforms. I will tell you, ranked choice voting is something we've seen in other countries just from a political science perspective, and we've seen it actually work out because there are many people who get frustrated in that it's a winner take all sort of proposition in many cases. And so what happens to your second or your third choice? Now, the caveat with that is that some fear that what happens when we look at whether it's a local election, a statewide election, when there is a Black candidate who is very successful or is getting a lot of traction, but the other options are people of other dynamics and demographics. And what does that mean in terms of some of those Black candidates? And does it want to split the vote? So I think sometimes the question is out, but I think it's worth investigating all these different options. I will say here in Maryland and Baltimore City in particular, we just came out of a primary election that was pretty much all mail-in voting, and it actually worked. And the great thing is we had higher turnout we've had in recent years. And so from our perspective, I was very encouraged. The other part that was very encouraging was that we had more young people turn out. I know a lot of us were concerned that, young people put their mail in, put their ballot in the mail, but we found out they actually did participate at higher levels. And so the point that was made by both of these brothers earlier, the reality is it's science. And so we look at a lot of young people, and we know that even in our election here in the city, young people actually swayed the election. Some of their votes came in later, but some of the candidates who they were energized by were some of those younger candidates. And the brothers also made some good points as it relates to the tangible outcomes, right? So again, we think about not only, judges, but also who's in some of these boards and commissions at the local and the state level, who's making some of these decisions, whether education, same issue in Florida with HBCUs. We have the same issue in Maryland as it relates to underfunding of HBCUs. So I'm glad that you are having that conversation. But again, you see also, unfortunately, across the country, there is this discouragement as it relates to mail-in voting. I find it very curious that you have a president who votes by mail regularly, then says you should not vote by mail because you can't trust it, right? And so you always have to think about who the messenger is. The other part that I would say, and you talked about the science of it, and I have to get back to this as a political scientist, but also as someone who's run campaigns, it's really around organizing. And you think about Obama for America, transition to organizing for America, and a lot of the young people who are energized they had to go back to the communities and figure out something. Are they going to be progressive leaders with labor unions or progressive organizations, environmental organizations, advocacy organizations? What are they going to do? And interesting enough, a lot of us, and I think about some of my new colleagues who are coming in at the local level and the state level, actually have an organizing background. And so you have to figure out where the votes are, how you target those votes. And so all of the reforms have to be targeted toward where are the votes, where are we not picking up folks, and where do we need to actually sway these elections. And a lot of that is really the science of it. And our brother talked about those boot camps. I've been through some of those. I've had younger students, and I'm glad the brother also talked about a relay race, because here's the reality. I have a young person on my staff right now, a former student of mine, who is now learning the legislative process, and I want him and others to be the people who carry those batons in the future, across both age, but also gender, and some of our young ladies as well. And so we have to be thinking about them very mindful, but being very careful about what happens for early voting. That's the other piece. What happens in terms of early voting? What does it mean in terms of the lines? And a lot of the attempts are really to roll back voting and not to encourage it and not to lift it up in states where we see that we need it the most.
Now, for the record, brother Sims, you brought up Schoolhouse Rock. For the record, my favorite was Conjunction. That was my favorite.
Okay.
And I want to say, but I want to address this to all of you. But I'll start with Brother Alexander. We have essentially a binary choice right now, and yes, we can talk about third parties as well. But the conversation right now is about Biden and Trump. There's been a lot of talk up until maybe the protests, but I think maybe even a little bit still now, that young people and progressives still can't really get behind Joe Biden. Rather than, and you got the Obama experience and relationship, and so you can probably talk a little bit about Joe Biden. But if we zoom out a little bit and not just make it about Biden and Trump, what is going to bring progressives and young people to the polls today or in November? If it's not what they're seeing already, are you nervous about a potential fall off? I know from a political science perspective, young people are often really tough to bring out to the polls, but it seems like we're in a moment where we can't lose any of those votes. So, Brother Alexander, how do you talk to young people right now and get them excited and energized if they aren't already?
Well, very great question. And the first thing is the strategy is set up where they want to create so much chaos and confusion where you tune it out and you don't want to participate at all. And I've had very in-depth conversations with my friends in my networks about their issues with one candidate over the other, and that this candidate is just like this candidate. But what I would suggest to them, one, is to not look at the candidate, but to look at the core issues. And I think it's our responsibility as surrogates who are trusted and are validators of these communities to step up and to articulate clearly why this is important. It's been said numerous times that if you're not at the table, you're on the menu. And so when you close your eyes and you think about who's going to be sitting at Donald Trump's table and who's going to be sitting at Joe Biden's table, it is clear. And so, you can look at anybody's record over 30 years and poke holes and find things that are concerning to you. I've never met a member of the legislature in Florida that I agree 100% on every single issue. But I think it's our responsibility to lay out to them and find the appropriate surrogates that they trust and lay out a very consistent message. The reality of the situation is one or the other will be the next president of the United States. And so, voting this party or voting this way or voting this way, you have to vote your future. And I think as we rationalize that and put that into perspective, and we identify the right surrogates and individuals in our communities to explain that, and to have them close their eyes and think about who's going to be at the table. I mean, I've seen some amazing optics where you look around the table. All white men around the table with Donald Trump. I've seen some amazing optics when Donald Trump walked from the White House over to the church and held the Bible up in front of the church was complete foolery. But you saw who was walking with him. And so when you look at the agencies and the departments and how it goes down, you can look at who's running the campaigns. You know, one of my good friends, Vincent Evans, who's a graduate of Florida A&M University, is the Southern Regional Political Director for Joe Biden. He's going to have a seat at the table. There are so many individuals throughout his apparatus organization, and you can call Vincent Evans and other people what you want to call them, but they are Uncle Toms. They are proven individuals that fight for our community, that understand the critical need for the issues that impact us every single day. They have been in the trenches, and if we create that type of dynamic and we step up to the plate and we explain it in that way, I think that our future and our young people will step up to the plate and they will vote in record numbers. I feel confident in it, and I think with the right stakeholders and the right surrogates, we will be able to successfully do that.
Brother, you made two references to your alma mater. I'm going to make one to Cornell. Go Big Reds. So I better get that out. Brother Bullock, though, is the two-party system enough for us? Is it not enough? I mean, I haven't met a lot of people who are advocates of a three or multi-party system, but I hear from a lot of young people that neither the Democrats or Republicans really represent their interests. You know, are you hearing the same thing? And what do you tell them?
You know, it's something that is growing, to be honest. I mean, actually, we have a lot of people who are unaffiliated or independent. But the reality is the way the system is set up, we do have a two-party system effectively. And so oftentimes the reality is that with a third-party candidate, you are throwing away a vote. And so we can go back to 2000, look at the state of Florida, the swing states. And so, again, having that third party, whether it's a green candidate or what have you, again, it causes confusion. Now, here's the other thing to also, you know, to be realistic about. And some of our brothers also mentioned this earlier. And unfortunately, a lot of times, you know, I know our parties, you know, Democrats tend to skew left, Republicans tend to skew right. But what happens on the left oftentimes is there's a purity test, right? And so that, you know, if there is some sort of, you know, issue, if you don't align on every particular issue, then somehow, you know, it is a failed proposition. Whereas on the right, they want to win, right? And so to the victor goes the spoils. And so you have to figure out if you want to win or you want to make a point. And so oftentimes we have folks who say, I want to make a point. Well, look at those people who said the never Hillary, the people who said, you know what, I was really, you know, all in for Bernie Sanders and I can't give my vote to Hillary Clinton. Well, now look at what you have, right? And so now you look at all of the judges, you look at the agencies, you look at all the rollback of environmental protections, legal protections, you know, issues along race and class. So those are very critical pieces. Now, I think there is a role, though, that alternative parties can play, which historically has been pushing the parties to particular ideological points, right? So, for instance, you've had some that are more progressive that then pull the party to the left, or in the case of the right, more conservative, pull the party, you know, to the right. But the reality is that in order to win a general election, you have to get to the middle, right? You have to be able to get those moderate voters. And so oftentimes those who may make you feel good are not the people who are going to be able to win the lion's share of the votes, the popular vote, the electoral college vote, which then transitions to who's actually running the country and what the results are going to be. So I'm sympathetic to the idea. I know that there are those who may say, hey, on this issue, Democrats represent me, on this one, they may not. So I think that latitude is important, but many of our states are closed primary states. And we know in our open primary states, we also do this crossover voting with the intention of derailing one particular party. So we have to be very careful as it relates to partisanship. I understand the fervor, but again, there are some realities to the way their system is set up.
Now, Brother Sims, I have a slightly different question for you. And so I want to switch gears because you've served in both houses. Is that right? You served in both. You have. So talk a bit about sort of the dynamics of state government and how important state government policy is to a lot of what we're talking about today. And I raise that question because I often say that presidential politics is really sexy, right? Because it's on air. I call it it's in the air, right? TV ads, not really a lot of mail, but TV ads, digital ads, things like that, big debates. But state policies seem to have the most impact on our day-to-day lives. You've served in both houses of state legislature. How do you feel that folks genuinely understand the dynamic there in terms of state and local politics versus national politics? And what's it like serving in both houses of the legislature and the sort of power dynamics there?
Well, let me start with the last question first. The two chambers are very different. You know, it falls along the old common law system of the House of Commons versus the House of Lords. You know, in the House of Representatives here in Illinois, you run every 2 years. So you get sworn into office in January and you're back running in September. So it is a very different dynamic. Whereas in the Senate, you have a 4 or a 2 year term depending on how it breaks down into a 10-year cycle. So the chambers are different. The Senate is more formal. The House is less formal. So the dynamics are different in that respect. But when I go back to Justice Brandeis's quote that states are the laboratories of democracy, because states, and you see how during this pandemic there were things that happened at the state levels that never could happen at the federal government. So the federal government could not get certain things done, but states were. States were stepping in and making advancements happen so that we could control the pandemic. And then where you're seeing where there were states who did not take this as seriously. Now you're seeing, for instance, here in Illinois, we're on the downward slope of the pandemic, but in other states you are seeing where they didn't shut down as quickly. They didn't put in mask requirements as quickly. You are seeing the cases of COVID-19 start to swing back up. But so from the state perspective, as you mentioned, people look at the presidential race and they think that, that's the race that is going to make a difference in my life. Well, the reality is when you look at state government has a direct impact on the education of your children, the health care that your family receives, the economic opportunities that your family has, the criminal justice system that you are subjected to. All of those things happen by state policy. So there is a bigger response. There is a bigger payoff, for lack of a better term, by investing in state elections than even investing in the presidential election. Or the presidential election will certainly impact the federal judiciary, it impacts the cabinet, it impacts national policy. But on a local level, when you want to drive change locally, that happens at the state and local level. So in order to be able to affect change and push policy, you want to be able to do that at the state level. And I say I've seen us be able to do a number of things. I mentioned early on the statewide body camera bill that became it became model legislation that we used, and there was a version of it passed in New York and a version of it passed in California. So those types of best practices established at the state level can help to drive policy that can be helped and pushed nationally at the federal government. But it's those kinds of ideas start at the state level and at state and local governments.
And in fact, let me stay with you for a minute. And if any other brothers have any ideas, please chime in. I don't mean to not have you engage in things that you would love to speak on. But let me stay with you for a minute, brothers. From the state level, then, how are you able to use some of the or expand economic opportunities for African Americans, particularly African American men, using state government, whether it's MWBE or other types of contracting arrangements? Because I imagine that, as we talk about African American men and the electorate, sometimes I think just even the act of the engagement with government and understanding that there are pathways that can lead to political and economic empowerment in and of itself could be a rallying point to sort of go to the polls and make change.
Illinois has, and I don't know how large the budget is in Florida or Baltimore or New York, but Illinois has a $40 billion general fund budget. $40 billion. So when we talk about the changes that are going to happen across the board, it starts with economics. I've often said that the safest communities are not the ones with the most law enforcement officers. The safest communities are the ones with the most resources. And when you start talking about procurement reform and involvement in how the government spends its money, that's where you really start to drive change in our communities. When you start to see economic opportunities spread themselves out in an equitable fashion so that everyone has a seat at the table, everyone has the same opportunity to invest and to engage in an opportunity to get local resources back in their local communities, that is when you start to see real change start to happen. So one of the items that we are working on as the Illinois Legislative Black Caucus, we are talking about how we are going to reform the state's procurement system to make sure that we are driving economic opportunities and contracting opportunities directly to African American businesses, so that they can then spend those resources and invest those resources in hiring people in disadvantaged communities, making sure that they have opportunities to support themselves and their families. You know, in the budget that we just passed, we put $600 million in that budget for direct supports to businesses that were hardest hit by the COVID-19 pandemic, specifically those where the pandemic hit the hardest. So $600 million for Black businesses who could come in, who were shut down because of the shutdown in the business shutdown, but also to rebound from those businesses who were shut out of the PPP program, or who were shut out of small business lending programs. So they have an opportunity to reinvest in communities, to build up our communities, so that we could recover from this. We are seeing that there's a study out there that says over 40% of Black businesses won't rebound or won't recover or recover from the pandemic. We need to be investing in those businesses and using government resources to do that, to make sure that they have the opportunity to survive and to thrive.
Now, I want to ask all of you this question. You're all elected officials, right? One thing one of the things, and I ran for office once, I lost, but I reflect often on that experience. I think subway stops were like my favorite thing when I was running for office, because you really get a very clear interaction with the voter, right? So talk to me about, and I'll start with you, Brother Alexander, as we look at or think about even running for office, what are some of the biggest issues or functions that we should pay attention to if we decide that we actually want to run for office, as opposed to participating in the process by voting? We actually want to represent constituencies. And before you get into that aspect of the question, I guess I'd first want to know, were you called to do it, or did you make a decision to do it?
Well, that's a very good question. And, I had no interest whatsoever to run for the House of Representatives, but the work I do every single day, I founded a nonprofit in my local community called Distinguished Young Gentlemen. We work with primarily single-parent home African-American males, 8th grade through 12th grade. And so looking at all of these generational cycles and the many challenges that single mothers go through every single day, I was called to do it based off the skill sets that I had. One of the brothers said earlier about the mentorship and understanding the process and working in the legislature and having great mentors like our current Congressman Al Lawson and our former state representative Curtis Richardson, being able to travel with them and being immersed in that process. And along with that, I think we have a responsibility in knowing that to raise the standard of leadership in our communities. Recently here in Florida, we voted on a $90+ billion budget. That means that's a lot of money and a lot of interest, a lot of lobbyists, and a lot of special money with super PACs and other forms of dollars. And so what it does, if we invest into ourselves and we invest into our own candidates, it gives them the flexibility and the freedom and the capacity to do the things they need to do in order to move our state forward. They're not beholden to anybody. In fact, when I ran back in 2016, I was 31 years old running at the time. I'm now 35. I spent roughly $250,000 to be elected to the Florida House of Representatives. Well, my first $114,000 were small dollar donations, $10, $15, crowdfunding, a wide range of things. And so before I took a dollar from downtown from specific organizations, labor unions and other organizations that had my interest, it put me in a position where I could speak truth to power. Running where you are and serving where you are two different things. And so you have to decide, I'm a pragmatic thinker, I'm not an ideologue. So from a strategist, I don't want to waste my time. You know, I'm making a lot of sacrifices to serve in the Florida House of Representatives. So I want to be effective. And so it gives me the leverage knowing that someone hasn't given me a $20,000 PAC check, or someone, I'm not obligated to do certain things, that I'm free, that I can speak truth to power, but also do it in a dignified way, in a strategic way to be successful. The next thing I will say is that, you know, in regards to this whole concept of running for office, I've never seen a stool stand on one or two legs. You know, in fact, if you were to sit down in a chair, you know, it only had one leg, you would fall over. And so I tell young people that, or anyone that has an interest in running for office, that you want to immerse yourself in public policy. You know, there are a lot of empty suits walking around. They look good, they sound good, but they know nothing. And so it's all for show. They're tweeting, they're hitting these basic points, but they don't know the issues. Well, because I read the bills, I read the conforming bills, I read the train bills, thousands of pages, thousands of words. It forces my Republican colleagues to sit down with me, because I'm going to go through a litany of questions to expose the BS that is being manifested and purported in the bill. And so you have to read, you have to be able to ascertain the information and explain it in a way where people can understand what's actually going on. But you have to also understand grassroots organizing. And it's something I learned at FAMU and being involved when I was student body president at FAMU. There was a young man killed at a boot camp by the name of Martin Lee Anderson, and we organized and did a 36-hour sit in the governor's office. All those skill sets that are necessary to connect with people, and then electoral politics. And I think if you have an interest in the process, you want to make sure that you immerse yourself in public policy. You want to immerse yourself in grassroots organizing. You want to immerse yourself in electoral politics and know how to leverage all of those tools to work together so that you have credibility and the capacity to really effectuate change. And just real quick, what I mean by raising the standard of leadership in our communities, it's you know this whole idea, I show up to your church when it's election time, or I throw you a fish fry or barbecue. People are sick and tired of that. They want substance, they want depth, you know. And what I've seen, and like I said earlier, my personal philosophy is no lights, no cameras, just action. You know, we had a massive hurricane come through, Hurricane Michael in Florida. And when I went out to my communities, I took no cameras, I took no pictures, no press releases, and we came up with action items. These are the 5 things we're going to work on. I listened, I talk less, and I listen more. I earned their trust. And from that, we were able to make those things become reality. I think if we do more of that, and we get more people that want to run for office, we're going to get more people that run for office who don't want to run for office. And they're taking their normal life and they're applying that normal life to impacting the community. I mean, anybody that wants to run for office either has never run before or you're crazy. I mean, the stuff you have to go through the process to do so is not a sexy thing to do, right? And so I like to find people, and this is the question that I ask, and I'll stop. Before I vote for you, the things that you're doing and the things that you have done, would you be doing those things if you were not in office or not? If you were never a state representative, never a city councilman, never a state senator, I look at your record of being consistent in your community and reflecting those values, because you don't have to be in elected office to make a difference. You don't have to. You can do nonprofit work. You can be a staffer. You know, I work for former mayor of Tallahassee, John Marks, who's the first full elected mayor of Tallahassee, African-American mayor in the city of Tallahassee. That was my first job out of college. I was engulfed in the whole process. I learned the process, and I kind of felt like I made a bigger impact doing that in some of the restrictions I have now, being an elected official with all of the sunshine laws and all of the other policies that kind of restrict you in what you can and what you cannot do.
Right. Now, Brother Bullock, I was talking to your state's attorney, Marilyn Mosby, yesterday at another panel and another discussion about criminal justice. She made a point that I think she said only 1% of all the district attorneys in the country are Black women. And then someone made a point a couple of years ago that 95% of all the district attorneys in the country are white. And that's a startling statistic. So I guess my question to you is, why is it so hard to run for office? Yeah. Especially when you're talking about things like district attorneys, which have so much power over criminal justice reform. Yeah, you're a political science professor. I often talk about Lipsky's street level bureaucrats, right? They have so much discretion, and what discretion they do have could make a huge difference in terms of things like criminal justice reform and policing. Is it really hard to run for office? Is it really that difficult? And what are some of the more difficult aspects of it that you've encountered?
It's a really good question. And I'll say, you mentioned you're running for office. My first time running for office was 2011. I did not win. So I know what that's like. I came back in 2016. I did win and got reelected in 2020. But the reality is that, it takes all the things that these brothers have talked about, right? It requires strategy, it requires fundraising, it requires organization. And so even looking at that state's attorney's race, as a political observer at that point, a political analyst, one of the things that I was noting was, the ability to have a coherent message, but also to have strategy, where you're going to go after those votes. And we recognize that whether we're talking about, mayor, city council president, state's attorney, any of these roles, especially when you're given license and power over agencies that typically have not had Black power and authority, there's oftentimes pushback. And so even the brother was mentioning in terms of fundraising, one of the most difficult things that I ran into the first time running was around fundraising. And so what does that require? How do you then, start off that process? The other part that was also mentioned is that, look, a lot of us, and I'll say, you asked the question before around, is it a decision, is it a calling? I think for many of it's both. I know as an undergraduate at Hampton University, that seed was planted. But then getting the opportunity to run, but also to be engaged in other people's campaigns, you learn along the way. So it can be difficult, especially if people see that they think that you're younger, it's not your turn yet. And so even telling our folks that, you have to wait your turn, right? Again, you have the capability, you have the skill set. But the other part that I would say, and I say this to someone, bachelor's, a master's, a PhD, people don't care how much you know as they know how much you care. Right. And so, even after I didn't win the first time, staying engaged in the community so people know who you are, but also that you're doing that work and you're being consistent. So again, if you don't have a lot of money, you better have a lot of people behind you. And so a lot of times there are people who have not done that work in the community and their work doesn't speak for them. So that makes it difficult. But name recognition, organization. Let me say another piece. I think this is very important because this was alluded to along the way. There are many roles to play in campaigns. We need Black people, Black men, Black women at the table who are doing things, not just about being the candidate, but being the campaign managers, the fundraisers, the consultants, the strategists, right? Also, who are the people who are the lobbyists who are helping craft these bills? Who are the political directors for organizations? And what relationships do you have with these people, whether you are a candidate or whether you're an activist? Because if you don't have those relationships, you can't get in those doors. And that has a lot to do with who finances campaigns, who people talk to once they're in office, and who's able to move the levers of power. So all those things affect us as candidates, as elected officials, and people who are on the campaign trail. But it is more scientific than people realize, and there are people who organize against you. So just like with physics, for every action, there's equal and opposite reaction. Well, the reality is that when there are things that people are rattled about that you may have done that may have been the right thing, it doesn't mean that they won't come for you. And we've seen this, whether our state's attorney and other elected officials who have done the right thing, but oftentimes there's that blowback. So we have to be very cognizant of those realities as well.
No, and Brother Sims was laughing when you talked about fundraising. I was wondering if you had a bad experience with call time one day. Is that were you in a closet somewhere with nothing but a phone and a glass of water? Is that what it was? It's
when you talk about campaigning, it really comes down to money, message, and manpower. That's really what it comes down to. As when I got my start, I never, and as I mentioned earlier, I was a staff person for a long time. I came out of Illinois State University, went to work for the former Senate president, the second African-American Senate president in Illinois history. Worked for him. He appointed me his budget director. I served as a budget director from the time I was 24 years old until I left the staff to go to law school and start practicing. When I left the staff, I had no intentions on running. I had seen how campaigns worked. I'd seen how things happen, but so I had no intention on running. So, but then, when you talk about, the fundraising aspect, so I ran like several of you have said, I ran the first time and I was not successful the first time. I learned as much from that loss than I did from the wins that I've had subsequently. And so when I lost in 2010, I remember having after the election was over, having coffee with a senior in my community. And she said to me, she said, "You are a great candidate. You are a fantastic candidate. It's not your time." To Brother Bullock, to your point, it was it's not your turn. It's not your time. And I remember thinking to myself at the time, what is this, double Dutch? It's not my time, not my turn. So, but it's, you have that, you have that reality that folks want to see. People may not have seen the work I was doing on foundations and boards locally, but they had not seen the work I was doing on raising scholarships for disadvantaged children and buying books for kids who didn't have them. But after they got to hear me more and to see that message, or to see those works, they understood the message I was talking about and the direction I was trying to send our community and the excellence I was trying to bring to our community. And that's really, and I learned that from that first race. And that's why I was laughing. That first race, we did not have the money to effectively communicate our message. We had a 20-year incumbent who had really been invisible in the community. He'd not been doing anything, but without the ability to communicate effectively to our community what we were trying to accomplish, that's, my campaign was not successful. But again, what I learned from there, it's establishing an organization, it's establishing a message that resonates with people and living up to your word. And when you can put together that the resources to effectively communicate the message that will resonate, that lets people know that you care about the things that they care about, and people believe in you, you can be successful. So when I came back in 2012, I ran for county board first, and I ran for the state house in 2012 in a 5-way primary. I got over 40% of the vote. So that was when you were able to communicate and go directly to the voters, and you have the resources necessary, that makes a difference. It makes all the difference in the world. But people have to know that you are willing to go the distance for them, and that is what has been. I'm so glad when I go out into my community now, and I don't have it. I mean, I not have anything on that says my name, but people recognize me, and they recognize me for the work that I do, not just because I'm their state senator, but they see me at their events where there's a challenge in the community. If somebody is hurt in the community, they see me showing up. They see me showing up when there are good things going on. They see me going on, showing up when bad things are going on. But they need to know that you are there for them, and that's what has been so effective for me in my personal journey in the elected position.
And I mean that's extraordinary, brother. Brother Alexander.
Yeah, I just wanted to say it's
Sure.
unfortunate that money is the mother's milk of politics, and oftentimes we live in this bubble where we think everybody knows who we are, but they don't. And you take a poll and you find out that your name identification is like 15 or 20%. So we get into these bubbles thinking that everyone knows us. And me being a political scientist and whatnot as well, I can look at a race and know who's going to win the race 98% of the time before a vote is even cast. And just you have to have the ability to micro-target and have layered communication strategies in a very condensed time with a very coherent message that connects with who you are and your track record of success. Now, that was difficult for me because, from a standpoint of talking about the things that I did, because I'm not a self-promoter. I do things all the time, and the way I was raised, you do it, but you don't brag about it. You may buy a young man a suit, or you may give someone some money to go to college, but you don't put it on social media and you don't post about it. But what people don't know, they don't know. So therefore, they don't know. And so it's your responsibility to run a record, and you have to have the resources to get TV time, do direct mail. It's a very sophisticated process. And so I encourage anyone that wants to run for office, don't waste your time. Get it right. Life is about progression, not instant gratification. And oftentimes we live in this microwave society where we want to throw it in the microwave and have it pop out. But we know our food tastes way better when we put it in the oven than we put it in the microwave. When I was 21 years old, I ran for the county commission. I was a sitting student body president at Florida A&M University, running against a incumbent who was a sitting county commission chair. And I can remember, just like yesterday, I was at an event and an elderly lady walked up to me and said, "Hey, you're a fine young man. I'm going to vote for you. Who are you running against?" She said, "Oh, baby, I can't vote for you. You're running against Jesus." And so it is an established African American incumbent. I had to learn, but I didn't have the money. I didn't have the resources. I spent about $35,000, but I got the bulk of that money the last 2 weeks because a poll came out showing me that I had him under 50% in a three-way race. I got about $18,000 in the last 2 weeks. All the TV spots were gone. All the radio spots were gone. I didn't have time to really integrate and do direct mail. And so I just did a high sign, high visibility campaign. And a high visibility sign campaign is not going to win because signs don't talk. And you have to have a coherent message that is targeted and very specific to be successful. So make sure if you want to run for office, bring your A game, learn the process, get involved with other campaigns, understand about the entire process so that you can be successful and you can bring value to your community.
Well, I would tell you the first thing I learned when I started to run for office was that I'm an introvert. Not a good thing when you're actually trying to get people to vote for you. Just a bit of housekeeping. We have a little time left. If there's anyone listening to our presentation, our webinar today, and wants a certain question asked, please put that in the chat. I'll do my best to get to it before we close tonight. But I want to ask each of you this question, and I'll address it to Brother Bullock first, just to zoom out a little bit and talk about what role Alpha played in your leadership, in the work that you do, in your political development, and how can we get the fraternity to play a role in mobilizing Black men moving forward?
Well, first, I love the question. So I will say, I got on the campus of Hampton University in '96 in fall, and I was just enamored by seeing what the brothers were doing on campus. They were doing educational seminars. They were actually talking about voting, things that were very attractive to me. And so I wound up becoming a spring 1998 initiate of the Gamma Iota chapter. And what I will say, and I find it to be one of the greatest things in life is that I had an opportunity to be an officer in our chapter. And so doing Robert's Rules of Order, I mean, that's important if you look at how we conduct our committee meetings.
Yeah, that's right.
So that was something that I see the brothers are laughing, right? Because again, if you know the rules, you know how to get things done. And that's very important. But also managing money, making sure that we were on top of our game. Here's another part that I also want to share with you. I mentioned the spring '98, but also my line brother, Opal Jones, is also a Howard County council member. And so here we are in the state of Maryland, both as policymakers, and he was also an officer within our chapter. And so I can tell you firsthand that it had a lot to do with our development. Now, where we are now as a fraternity, I think is also interesting. We know we have the whole history of a voteless people to hopeless people. And I think things like we're doing tonight are very instrumental. I look at, what we do in terms of partnering with other organizations around not only voter registration, but also voter education. I'm happy to be, here, at close to the headquarters of our organization and thinking what we can do not only at the national level, but our local bodies. And I think we have the opportunity to marshal our individuals, whether we're in elective office, whether we are on boards or commissions, or whether we're leading some of our civil rights organizations. We have brothers at the local level who are leading nonprofits, advocacy organizations, and making sure that they're at the table. Because oftentimes as alphas, we have a lot of brothers who are very strategically placed, but we don't utilize them as best as we should. And that's something we have to continue to work on and fine tune.
Brother, that right there, that's an excellent comment. And I've been talking to some of my brothers here in New York about that same thing. Just amazing when you find that brothers are in places you just didn't even expect. And it's such a blessing. Brother Sims, I throw the same question to you. How has Alpha contributed to your political life, your leadership, and how can the fraternity help going forward?
Well, I got initiated at the Eta chapter at Illinois State University. And from there, just being immersed in, we followed the mission of the fraternity to a T. We developed leaders, promoted brotherhood and academic excellence while providing service and advocacy for our communities. And brothers of our chapter, when you were duty bound to lead in our chapter, and that just continued as I became an alumni brother, becoming the youngest chapter president of Mu Delta Lambda chapter history, and going into leadership in the district, going in and eventually becoming district director of the great district of Illinois, and eventually becoming the 26th regional vice president of the Midwestern region. You know, if you can survive and succeed in alpha politics, every other politics is easy. Because you can always tell an alpha man because you can't tell.
Did you say that out loud, brother? Did you say that out loud? Was that your inside voice?
Hey, absolutely. You know, and the fraternity it challenges you. You know, as the Bible says, as iron sharpens an iron, so as sharp as a brother sharpens another, right. And that is so true. You know, alpha demands the best out of you. It brings the best out of you. It challenges you. And I have been so pleased that all of the, and as Brother Bullock was talking, I laughed at when the reference to Robert's Rules of Order. I remember when I was in law school and I was in a group in law school, and we were not adhering to Robert's Rules of Order. And I challenged the other members of the organization. How can we as incoming attorneys not follow the rules of the game and how you run a meeting? And you learn those kinds of things from alpha. You learn the ability to focus on not just doing the right things, but doing things right. And you got that experience, and it starts at the chapter level. It starts when you focus on activities in the district and in the region and in the national and the general organization. Alpha has been critical to my personal development. And when you talk about a voteless people as a hopeless people, and the widening social program. So the history book, it references the widening social program, and that's where this discussion really, in my mind, it's an offshoot of that. We are continuing to exert the mission of the fraternity and adhere to the mission of the fraternity to make sure that we are providing service and advocacy for the communities that we serve. Because if the communities are going to go, we are going to have to lead. And that's where alpha is so important, so critically important, and partnering with other organizations, other of our Divine Nine organizations, Masonic organizations, other organizations that are just doing great work in the community, getting together under a collective agenda to move our communities forward. That's what people are really clamoring for. I talk about the young people who, we've talked about the civil unrest that's happened across the country. What you are hearing from young people is value my life and place a value and a premium on my life, and don't prioritize corporate profits over my life and my experiences and my opportunities. Well, that's where alpha steps in to say, listen, we have these experiences. We have the ability to invest in young people. We have the opportunities. We have a track record where we have demonstrated that we will invest in and we will show young people the way, and we will give them opportunities, because you are never too young to learn, never too old to learn, nor too young to teach. And you get those things having experiences right here in Alpha Phi Alpha. And that's why I'm so proud of the work that we have done and to be a part of discussions like this.
Thank you, brother. So, Brother Alexander, the same question to you. What's the role of alpha in your life and in moving forward and mobilizing the community?
Well, that's a great question. And I have never been nervous standing on the floor of the Florida House of Representatives or on any committee in the political process. But I have been nervous standing in front of the debating chapter of Alpha Phi Fraternity Incorporated at FAMU because it brings out the best in you. I remember looking on my line. There were probably 3 or 4 other individuals that could run for student body president at FAMU that I thought were better leaders than I was, or were more advanced than I was, just on my line. So just to walk into a meeting with 50, 60 plus brothers that are sharp, that are impressive, it forces you to understand, like the brother said earlier, iron sharpens iron. And because of that investment, I tell people all the time, the most important thing we can do for a young person is to model good behavior. And seeing alpha man lead by example, running for leadership roles, not being in major leadership roles, but being influencers in the process, understanding strategy in regards to membership and understanding strategy in regards to how you move your chapter forward. All of those things helped me significantly. I remember when I ran for Senate president at Florida A&M University, my junior year, my sophomore year going to my junior year, I actually won by 1 vote. It was 18-17. And I was a neo in the chapter the previous year, and I had to stand in front of the entire chapter and present my Senate President presentation. I was already an alpha, so it was done in decent in order. But they exposed so many holes in my presentation, and I had to literally change 2 votes in order to win. I didn't have the votes to win. But because my presentation was so thorough and so detailed, and the brothers of Beta Nu invested in me so much, it has an impact on me today in detail and overcoming adversity. I will also say, my current political career, I talked about that initial $114,000 that I raised before I raised $250,000 in my state house race. Well, 38,000 of that 114,000 came from Gamma Mu Lambda brothers of the Gamma Mu Lambda chapter, Tallahassee, and Beta Nu, and of course some other brothers that I know throughout. But it was Beta Nu alphas writing checks, people like Daryl Parks, individuals like Will Packer. I mean, I called Will Packer on the phone. He's my ism, and he was in the middle of the interstate, and he said, "What's going on, ism? What's going on, Will?" I said, "Hey," I said, "How much money do you need? What's the max?" And he said, "I'm gonna have my secretary call. I'm gonna max out in every level I can max out." Hung up the phone. He knew what I was calling for. And so that investment positioned me so that I can move forward to be successful. So, I believe this fundamentally, that there's no such thing as a natural born leader, that effective leadership is an acquired skill. And so if it wasn't for alpha, my father's a great alpha man. Both of my godfathers are great alpha men. I had the opportunity to be co-campaign manager for James S. Cromwell, who was the Southern Regional Vice President of Alpha, and being involved in that process. And there's nothing like alpha politics, and it really prepares you for the real world and the real process. And so I'm very grateful for that experience, and I'm very grateful for all the brothers that continue to invest in me.
So, brothers, I have one last question before I turn it over, and this is a lightning round. So if you could just be very quick, because we got about a minute to wrap this part up. And it's a philosophical question, I guess, of sorts. One of the things that I love to tell young people is never internalize a no. So in your political lives, as people have talked to you about, it's not your time and it's not your place. Brother Bullock, I'll start with you. How do you not internalize a no, and what do you do to get yourself back up and moving forward in the direction you want to go in?
It's a great question. One of the things that I've learned is that no doesn't always mean no forever. It might be no right now, but what can I do to make it a yes? Right. And so that's part of it. And so sometimes when we figured out it's a no, figuring out what was the challenge along the way and what kind of learned from this. And so I'm a runner as well. And I think my coaches always told me about every race is a learning experience. And so what do you learn from that? What do you take away from it? And how do you then transition that into a positive?
Thank you, Brother Sims.
Yeah, it's trying to figure out not internalizing that no is just, how do you make that a yes? And how do you turn the no, if it's a no, even if it's a no permanently, what do you learn from that and make it better till you get to yes from somebody else? Because if you have to overcome that no, it means you got to get 2 yeses from somebody else. So you have to figure out how you're going to do that. So don't get discouraged. Just figure out how you get to yes. And even if it's not with that person, try and figure out who it is with the next.
So if you tell me no, I'm just going to go around you. Is basically it.
I'm gonna try and get you to yes.
Yeah.
But if I cannot, I'm gonna have to try and find somebody else who will say yes.
Got it, Brother Alexander. That last point to you.
Well, I would say this: if you want to be great, you can't be afraid to fail. But also, if you're going to step out there, make sure you have your stuff together so you don't make a fool of yourself. And so when I ran when I was 21 years old, I was 359 votes for getting the incumbent in a runoff, because I had my stuff together. I did not attack him personally. I attacked the issues. And oftentimes, you go out there, your first impression is a lasting impression. I was able to take that momentum and that name ID in a 4-way primary, Democratic primary, to be elected to the Florida House of Representatives 10 years later. I was 21 at the time when I ran. And then when I ran again, I was 31 at the time. And so, I would say this, get out there. If you believe that you've been called to do something, and you believe that you can bring value to the process, go for it. But make sure you have your stuff together, because you only get one chance oftentimes with voters. And if you make a fool of yourself and you lack credibility and you're not a credible candidate, it kind of sets you up in the loser bracket, and you continue to be a loser. And, alpha men aren't losers. We take steps forwards and we don't take steps backwards.
All right. Brothers, it's been a blessing to be able to chat with you tonight. Thank you so much for your input and your insight. I want to bring in Brother General President to close us out this evening. And I want to thank you, Brother President, for allowing me the opportunity to moderate, and hope that we were able to hold the ideals of the fraternity up high.
Yes, thank you. Thank you so much. And brother, you did more than uphold it, you surpassed it. And to all of our brothers, thank you for a most informative and in-depth discussion. What I heard tonight was we discussed electoral politics, and you gave us a blueprint to victory. But more importantly, you were open and transparent in your success and your failures, and how we can use those as role models. They can be role models for so many others. I especially want to thank you for giving us a look into the governance of your area. When you talk about a $60 billion budget, a $90 billion budget, and your role in the appropriations process and understanding how government works. And that is so important. And then also the way you talked about mentorship and how important it is to have mentors in your life, and how each one of you have taken on that role to be mentors for others now, and to have that boot camp in the Florida Black Caucus where we're training that next generation of young men and women to take important roles, and understanding the diversity in the campaign process and in the electoral process, not only as the candidate, but the public policy person, the fundraiser. But what we took away from this conversation, and I know all of us gained so much, is that in the very title of this conversation, this webinar, the power of Black men in electoral politics, you have defined that for us tonight, how important it is, and how we also, as Brother Sims said, is all of us working together, all of the fraternities in the Divine Nine, all of the Panelist Council members, all of our Masonic brothers and others, and all of us coming together as Black men. This is a critical election cycle, and all election cycles are important. But as it was so eloquently put by Brother Alexander, when you look at who's walking across the plaza going to the St. John Chapel, that was a very clear picture. And as you said, that potato salad is different for everybody. But we've got to make sure that we have the right person and persons representing the interest. And what I really appreciated about what you said tonight was the discussion about we as Black men and others running for public office, and what you have to have in your portfolio, that commitment, that integrity. And yes, if you don't win the first time, make sure, as it was said earlier, that you have credibility in the community, because if it's not about service in your heart for the community, you should not seek public office at all. So brothers, thank you for what you've done tonight. Our conversation will continue. This fraternity will always be, first of all, servants of all as we transcend all. But more importantly, what we've got to do now is to lead by example, that in this election cycle, that the men of Alpha Phi Alpha will be in the front of the brigade, leading onward and upward always. So again, thank you. Thank you for being here with us tonight, and thank you for sharing with the audience, and look forward to our next conversation and future webinars as we come together to continue to make sure that we are not distracted with propaganda, that we stay focused on what's important, and what's important is the service of our people. So thank you so much, my brothers, and we look forward to future conversations in the future.